Test. That's live. Test. Oh, there we go. So those who've been waiting for the last half hour wondering where we are, my apologies. But we are but four here in the sanctuary today. And I know there was some confusion about whether we had Haftarah, because the weekly notice said Haftarah after. But really it was Torah study that was going to be after. But it's a beautiful, stark blue day, eerily, surreally like what it was 20 years ago, if you haven't looked out your window. So the four of us here are going to read what is the Torah reading for today. It is the shortest Torah reading of the year, Parshat Vayelech. It is all of 30 verses. One chapter Deuteronomy, chapter 31. And I'll find a page in Plout. And we're going to talk about, we'll read it and talk about it. In fact, we'll do something we very rarely do, which is we're going to read some of the Plout introduction. In this case, it may actually be Dudley Weinberg, Rabbi Dudley Weinberg. I'm not quite sure who wrote. As you might know, the Plout commentary is really the coalescence of three rabbis, Rabbi Bamberger, Rabbi Plout, and Rabbi Weinberg, maybe. Let me look. So you can find Parshat Vayelech in the Plout 2nd edition, page 1386. There we go. And here we go. And I'm going to start us off. And Michiko, can I give you this microphone to pass along? This way everyone will hear us on the live stream, even if they can't necessarily. You can see us from here, sort of. But this way, no, just hold it for now. Just hold it, and as different people read, we'll pass it along, okay? But I'm on page 1386. This is the, this is actually, so you might recall Rabbi Plout, when he edited this commentary, did not actually pay so much attention to the Parsha divisions, to the divisioning of the weekly portion. And so you might notice that it says final appeal and farewell continued. And that's because in the first edition, Nitzavim and Vayelech had a joint introduction of which this has been separated and moved, right? You'll also remember that in some years we have them read together on a single Shabbat, okay? So if you went back to page 1372, that's actually where you see final appeal and farewell, and that's continued. That's actually continued from the end of Kitavo, because despite the fact that we have weekly parashiot and we have chapter headings, Rabbi Plout chose to do a topical division. So if you turn to page 1348, I'm actually going to start there on 1348. See, it says final appeal and farewell.
Yes, it says that again and again.
Yes, well, that's because there's a long essay that covers three, that he sees this as covering three parashiot. Keep in mind, it's not that many chapters. It's essentially 3.5 chapters. The last part of Deuteronomy drives home the book's points. It summarizes Israel's history, highlighted by the establishment of the covenant, which is really important, right? I would say the reestablishment of the covenant, but again, whether Deuteronomy is aware of the covenant as established in Exodus is a matter of some debate. Then in covenantal style, it recapitulates blessings and curses with heaven and earth invoked as witnesses to this formal restatement. This final appeal contains two important theological statements. One, future generations too will be bound by the covenant. In fact, I talked about this in my sermon last week. This notion that covenant is not this, right? Like Why does the government get to tell me da da da? Well, that's the social compact. The social compact isn't just with those who are here. The social compact was founded with those long ago, and it goes into the future. We can't renegotiate from the ground up the social compact every single generation, although there seems to be that inclination in this country at the moment, right? So one, future generations, two, will be bound by the covenant, and two, the book that testifies to that covenant, probably Deuteronomy, is accessible to all Israel. It's not a hidden document in the possession of a special caste. So unlike some, Karen, all good?
I'm looking at those flowers that are sort of, is something going to fall?
No, they've been pretty stable there since they got put in. There's a weighted base, I think. I think the base is weighted. Fear not. Fear not. If you see something happening, but I'm pretty sure it's a weighted base. Just want to make sure we don't have anything falling to the ground here. The book that testifies to the covenant is accessible, right? It's in your mouth and on your lips. There are traditions in which revelation and covenant are hidden documents. There were times in medieval Europe, outside of Jewish tradition, where the Bible was actually prohibited from being in the hands of laity and was only allowed to be held and studied by the clergy. But that's not the case here. Following the long passage of curses, we are told that Joshua is formally appointed as Moses' successor. Then the book comes to a close on a poetic note, much like Genesis, with a song or a poem, since the Hebrew word shir, shirah, means both song and poem, as well as a blessing. So that'll be next week. Chapter 32 is Ha'azinu, and then chapter 33 as we get to Vizot HaBracha. This part of the book contains a number of words not found elsewhere in Deuteronomy. Examples are lima'an taskilu, in the sense of that you may succeed, and olah, oath, or sanction, which is frequently used in chapter 29. Vayat shame, uprooted them. Let's see what else is in here. I'm just checking footnotes. Such linguistic variants suggest to some that these passages may have come from a separate source that was later joined to the bulk of Deuteronomy. However, the integration of these passages into the main text is such that they now form, indeed, an essential part of the whole. They give the latter its literary climax and leave hearer and reader with a prophetic vision. Finally, Moses opens his final address by again recounting in glowing terms the deeds of God. From that list of beneficent feats, Moses draws the conclusion that it would be worth Israel's while to follow the divine covenant in the future. The rest of his speech is found in the next Sidra. We're going to turn ahead then to page 1372. Would someone like to read other than myself on 1372? And we'll pass the microphone to whoever's going to read on 1372.
1372.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to read, Barbara?
Here, just
Where are we starting?
Deuteronomy is set.
Deuteronomy is set in the time immediately preceding Moses' death. The Israelites, whom he had led for the past 40 years, are poised to enter the promised land. They are camped on the plateau of Moab, east of Jericho, across the river Jordan.
And if you want, they're giving you as very atypical, but thank you. There is a map.
There's a map you can look at.
On page 1159, in case that would be of service to you. 1159, so that you can remember that east of Jericho means modern-day Jordan.
On the other side of the river.
Right. We often forget that they did not come up through the Sinai desert, but they went through Sinai and then came around on the other side of the Jordanian mountains. people forget an awful lot. So you can see that right there in the map.
Yes.
Okay?
They're camped on the plateau of Moab, east of Jericho, across the river Jordan. As the Sidra opens, Moses is addressing the assembled people in the midst of his final oration. For more on this discussion, go somewhere else.
Keep going.
The last oration, the final address of Moses following the pattern made familiar by previous orations.
Keep the mic as close as you can, okay? Thank you.
Okay. As found in the previous Sidra, he began by recounting the wondrous deeds of the Eternal, including Israel's willingness to be in the covenant with God. Now he proceeded to restate the obligations arising therefrom for Israel as God's subjects. Then he established the sovereign's exclusive right to their loyalty, and he concluded with a catalog of consequences, rewards, and punishments. The address thus follows the outline of the treatise between ruler and ruled, which were encountered in Hittite and Neo-Assyrian documents, and which the Torah conveniently covenant, the Torah covenant reflects repeatedly.
Yeah, and you'll see there's a footnote. You can actually read an essay at the intro to Deuteronomy itself by William Hallow, who was a professor at Yale on the ancient Near East.
Yes.
Professor Hallow wrote this essay on Deuteronomy and ancient Near Eastern literature. The notion that the covenant in Deuteronomy echoes in detail many of the covenantal sovereign vassal treaties that we find in the political milieu surrounding ancient Israel, that this language doesn't come from nowhere, but it reflects the language of the larger world. Okay? That's not to say that there aren't unique elements. Of course there are. After all, God is not a human ruler. But nevertheless, that the language follows patterns. Just like the American Declaration of Independence that followed the writings of, language we find from the Enlightenment and other writings that preceded. So too Deuteronomy reflects some of the concepts and language found in these sovereign vassal treaties that you can find in the ancient Near East. They especially like to point out the Hittite would mean Anatolia, Turkey, and Neo-Assyrian, which would be Iraq, northern Iraq. Keep on going, Barbara.
However, the last oration also presents a novel feature for Deuteronomy. In the reason, I just lost.
At top of the column.
Okay.
In the
You
recent
said,
events.
okay, in the recent
No,
gi-
same page. So don't flip
giving
pages.
for the repetition of the covenantal
No,
frame.
Let me help you.
I lost myself.
That's okay.
In the reason given
Mm-hmm.
for the
There you go.
repetition of the covenant framework, Israel has heretofore not fully understood the extent of God's works because it has not had a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. In a vision by Isaiah, God expressed this thought in a similar way. See the Haftarah for Yitro.
Yeah, there is, in fact, in Deuteronomy, a lot of echo language from some of the prophetic words of second Isaiah. We get the notion, for example, of God hiding God's presence or God's face. Some of the theological concepts in Deuteronomy seem to echo some of the exilic and post-exilic ideas that we encounter in the prophetic writing, which is
working.
and the bringing in of knowledge and forms that must have been influenced by the
Surrounds.
Babylonian exile, even though the center of Deuteronomy very much seems to be a product preceding the exile. The end of Deuteronomy, which of course would have been perhaps worked on in exile, right, by whatever committee, the select committee of editing the Torah. Remember, Ezra brings that Torah scroll back to be read aloud. But we're going to see this in Vayelech, actually. That committee's work is very apparent. Okay, keep on going, Barbara.
The address is categorized by broad and sweeping vigor, its words couched in striking prose, its images rich in compelling allusions. Its style and word choice distinguishes it from Moses' earlier orations. Some believe it to be a product of the Babylonian exile, when the punishments here predicted had already become bitter reality. This section lays down an enduring foundation for Israel's religious, in that the Torah is declared to be valid for all generations, freely accessible to every member of the people, and not, as among other nations, the possession of a privileged few.
And by the way, that notion becomes incredibly important in the Enlightenment, where the notion of governance and state, no longer the divine right of kings to simply rule as they wish, but rather, yes, you can have a king if you want to have a king, but ultimately, you are accountable to the governed, right?
Yes.
And the governed have a right to know the laws that they're being governed
By. Yeah.
And even the human ruler is answerable to a higher authority. That is quite an innovation, and it goes all the way back here. Finish up, please.
The importance of these statements prompted the liturgy of the Reform movement to include readings from this passage in the afternoon service of Yom Kippur.
Yeah, we changed the traditional, the readings on the holidays are not set in stone.
The change.
The Mishnah, in fact, has different listings. It evolved over time. And in the Reform movement, we've changed a number of the traditional readings, even in recent years, to different readings that seem appropriate to the themes of the holiday. Let's turn ahead. So Nitzavim was last week, and now we're going to go to Vayelech. Okay, final appeal and farewell. Karen, perhaps you'd like to read?
Yeah.
And if you take the microphone.
Sure, but where are we
We're
now?
on page 1386. One of the things that would be great, I keep thinking, is if we would produce an edition of this with those little thumb notches.
Yes.
I just got a new edition, the Magerman Foreign Bible, and they have little thumb pieces
Yes.
for each book of the Bible. It's
Yeah.
very, very helpful.
Like an address book.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Right. So, final appeal and farewell. Deuteronomy is set in the time immediately preceding Moses' death. The Israelites, whom he has led for the past 40 years, are poised to enter the Promised Land. They're camped on the plateau of Moab to the east of Jericho, across the River Jordan. Like the previous Sidra, with which it is often combined, this Sidra, the Torah Shortest, portrays Moses as addressing the assembled people, and he continues his final oration. Moses prepares for death. The discourses are now concluded, and the Torah turns to the narrative of Moses' last days, his preparations for death, the appointment of Joshua as his successor, and the final instructions he issues to Joshua and the Levites. This section does not present a straightforward account. After introductory words of parting, Moses charges the priests to write down the teaching and to have it read to the people once every 7 years during the Feast of Booths. Then with verse 14, a passage begins that clearly did not originally form part of the account. It interrupts the story, which continues in verse 24 and contains Hebrew terms not otherwise found in Deuteronomy.
Apparently, my mic needs some fresh batteries. Hang on.
Okay.
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 Apparently, thank you, Ken Roth, the angel of technology, for today. Apparently my batteries were dying.
Okay.
Keep on going, Karen.
Okay. So Moses went and spoke these things to all Israel. He said to them, I am now 120 years old, and I can no longer be active. Moreover, the Eternal has said to me, you shall not go across yonder Jordan. It is indeed the Eternal your God who will cross over before you, and who will wipe out those nations from your path, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua is the one who shall cross before you, as the Eternal has spoken. The Eternal will do to them as was done to Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites, and to their countries, when God wiped them out. The Eternal will deliver them up to you, and you shall deal with them in full accordance with the instruction that I have enjoined upon you. Be strong and resolute. Be not in fear or in dread of them, for it is indeed the Eternal your God who marches with you. God will not fail you or forsake you.
Excellent. So we get this wonderful term, chazak ve'amatz, be strong and courageous, or strong and resolute. I want to point out something that's not totally clear to us. If you're following at home, by the way, in the Plout, second edition, page 1387. If you're just following in a Bible, Deuteronomy 31. We just stopped at the end of Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, and we're going to start in a moment at verse 7. But it's confusing to people because all of these nations that get mentioned are not really clear in our mind. The Amorites are, in fact, generic Canaanites. They are the people who are getting dispossessed. However, there have been other nations we've been involved with. In fact, we're very aware of them, but they are relatives. They are relatives of the Israelites, and they don't get dispossessed. That would be Moabites and Ammonites, right? Those are, in theory, Abraham's grand nephews, right? That's Lot's incestuous offspring by his daughters, right? So the Ammonites and the Moabites, who are also, and then we have the Edomites. Those are Esau's descendants. So they don't get dispossessed either. The only people who the Israelites are given carte blanche to dispossess are the Amorites. And there are very many subgroupings of Amorites. These are the Canaanites who are presented in Scripture as being guilty of terrible perversions, immorality in the land of Canaan. And because of that, God, who is the landlord or the owner, has the right of eviction. In fact, that very notion of God as the I think leaseholder would be the right word, that therefore we can be dispossessed, we can be thrown out, right? We can be evicted, just like those who came before us. And that's a very important concept. Today, when we read this story, because of modernity and political considerations, we are very concerned with the notion of a God who simply dispossesses a group of people. How could that be moral? How could that be ethical? But you have to remember the framework here, which is the Israelites are being brought in as a punishment upon the Amorites. Had the Amorites behaved appropriately, they would not have been dispossessed, perhaps, okay? So, and we get that notion in the prophets. The prophets make the point that God moves all sorts of people around. We who have historical memory of the Second World War can keep in mind that 200 million people or more were dispossessed and moved around the planet in the decades of World War II and following, right? If we think about all of these land partitions, and peoples that were moved, the partition of India, all of these things, hundreds of millions of people were moved following World War II. And so, I'm sorry? And World War I as well, as Barbara is pointing out to us. Is that Ken updating me on the, who's ringing? I think that's you, Barbara. Find out if there's anything else that Ken says I need to do. Okay, we'll pay attention, I promise. Ken is the angel of the AV today. Okay, maybe it's not Ken. So I want to point that out. I want to point out that what we're reading here is not like, oh, God is on our side and he's not. No, the Israelites are benefiting from the fact that their predecessors did not keep whatever covenant they had. They're being dispossessed, and now they are being given what is apparently a conditional covenant, a conditional lease as homeowners in the land of Israel. Mitchie, would you like to read a little with verse 7? And we'll give you the microphone, please. Hold it as close as you can while you're reading, please.
Then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and resolute, for it is you who shall go with this people into the land that the Eternal swore to their fathers to give them, and it is you who shall apportion it to them. And it is indeed the Eternal who will go before you. God will be with you. God will not fail you or forsake you. Fear not, and be not dismayed." Moses wrote down this teaching and gave it to the priest, son of Levi, who carried the ark of the Eternal covenant, and to all the elders of Israel.
Okay. So here, verse 9 is really a wonderful verse, which is worth spending a little time with. And I'm going to read the Hebrew. Vayichtov Moshe et haTorah hazot. That's what's translated as Moses wrote down this teaching. I want to read it again. Vayichtov Moshe et haTorah hazot. Moses wrote down this Torah. Now, we'll talk about teaching in a moment. Vayitna el, actually in some cases it's also vocalized, I think, Vayitna, el haKohanim b'nei Levi, hanosim et Aaron brit Adonai. And he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi. That's interesting, right? This is very similar to what Ezekiel does. HaKohanim HaLevi'im, the Levitical priests. Remember what I've argued with you based on my teachers, that originally the term for priest in ancient Israel was Levite. The term was Levite. We know that the term Kohen is a pan-Semitic term used all over the ancient Near East. Kahanu, Kahan, right? And eventually a group of Levites is elevated above all of their Levitical brethren, and the claim is that they are descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, who have been raised above the other Levites, which is how the story unfolds in the book of Exodus. But maybe that's not exactly what took place. Maybe it is. But the term, the fact that the Kohanim are, well, of course you know Kohanim are B'nai Levi, that the Kohanim, the priests, are the sons or the descendants of Levi. Why would you need to say that unless you were composing this document at a transitional point where you wanted to make that point. You were adopting a new terminology, right? And you wanted to point out that Kohanim are in fact Levi'im, okay? And that they carry the ark of the Eternal's covenant, which is interesting because actually the Levites themselves carry the ark. It's given to, right, the sons of Aaron, and to the elders of Israel. The elders of Israel is also an unusual term here, because the question of where does authority reside, on Aaron's line and the priesthood, or does authority lay with a different line? Of course, we know this line from the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, right? Moses received Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders, right? The elders to the men of the great assembly. So this notion is that the priests represent religious leadership, but the elders, remember that story in Exodus and also in Numbers, they go up the Sapphire Road and they have lunch with God. Who exactly, we're getting now, up until now, Moses has really been the leader. Yes, Aaron, his brother, is, but Moses occasionally acts as a priest. We know that. He ordains Aaron and his sons. Now we're going to get a real split. Joshua is a military political leader, and Eleazar, that's Aaron's son, Eleazar now is the high priest, and we have a division between religious leadership and military political leadership. And we see it here. We see it by the inclusion of the Ziknei Yisrael, the elders of Israel. That doesn't mean old people. Here, Ziknei Yisrael refers to a political class of leaders. So Moses wrote down this Torah. Well, what is this Torah? Is it a single teaching? In fact, you know that I don't like the word teaching for Torah, right? What word do I prefer? Instruction. Because the root for Torah really, so Moses wrote down this instruction. Is it a singular instruction? Is it a whole book? Not really clear. And he gave it to the priests who carried the ark. It's not quite clear where they carry it. It just tells us they were the carriers of the Ark of the Covenant, where the Ten Commandments are stored, and to all the elders of Israel. Mitchie, would you keep going? Verse 10, if you would, please.
I'm sorry. And Moses instructed them as follows. Every seventh year, the year set for remissions at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Eternal your God in the place that God will choose. You shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere the Eternal your God and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere the Eternal your God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess.
Terrific. Now, in this text, this is called Shemitah. Shemitah is the remission of debts. We read about this previously in Deuteronomy 15. Every seventh year you shall practice the remission of debts. This is a little bit different than Leviticus 23, Parshat Bahar, where we were told that the land is to lie fallow every seventh year, and the land is to receive a sabbatical year. The sabbatical year and the remission of debts are supposed to go together. And in fact, if you go back to Deuteronomy 15, some of our laws regarding charity, tzedakah, loans, not charging interest, all of that is in fact laid out in Deuteronomy 15. It's a very, very important chapter. So here it's reiterated, and we have added onto it that the Feast of Booths, we should show up. This is the mitzvah called hakhel, assemble. You shall assemble the people. Now, it doesn't tell us where, because it can't say Jerusalem, because David hasn't been born yet. He hasn't conquered the city of Jebus, right? So it has to be, we use the circumlocution, right? When all Israel comes to appear before the eternal your God in the place that God will choose. The long version is in the place where God will choose to make his name dwell, the dwelling place of God's, that will be associated with God's name. So every seventh Sukkot, you're going to read this Torah. See, I know they like teaching here. I'll tell you why I don't like teaching. If I offer a teaching, you can do anything you want with it. If I give you an instruction, there's an obligation involved, right? A teaching is like it's, whatever you want to do with it. The word Torah has more force than teaching. The word Torah implies instruction from God. If I am your parent or your teacher and I give you an instruction, I have a set of, right. And your response to my instruction matters. So that's why I'm not quite a fan of this word teaching, although it's a nice, sweet word, and it's far softer than the old translation for Torah, the law.
Now, do you equate instruction with command?
Yes, it's very close. So you could have a single mitzvah, ki ha-mitzvah, right? We saw that in last week's, right? This command that I give you is not too onerous. Mitzvah seems to be more smaller, and then the concept of Torah seems to be a little bit broader, but they both contain obligation. Without doubt, they contain a notion of obligation. We know that from the root. The root for Torah is the same root for both instructor, teacher, and parent. It's also the root to take aim at a target, to hit the target.
So it's Yirah you're talking.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, because it connects to More, so More Torah, so I thought, teaching and instruction are not just that you differentiate so strongly, but I have a feeling that, from those roots, it can be both used as teaching and instruction.
I think it can. We do have another word in Hebrew, and that is lomed. So the verbal root, lamed mem daled, is used both for learning and for teaching. So in the kal, the pa'al, ani lomed, I am learning. But in the PL, the causative, ani milamed, I am teaching. In fact, the word malamed, Jewish name, right? Malamed doesn't mean storyteller. Eventually it comes to mean a malamed is right, is some sort of storyteller, right? But that's not really its meaning. A malamed is a teacher, a tutor, okay? In English, we don't have a word based on the same root that I can think of for the learner, the student, the pupil, and the teacher, the instructor, okay? That's why I'm not such a big fan of teaching for Torah, right? Yes, a moreh or a morah is a teacher, an instructor, but I want to go to that word parent. When we use the term horim, it's the same root, horim. Horim means parents, okay? to be a parent is to direct your child. From the biblical point of view, parents direct their children. So if I'm giving you Torah, I'm giving you direction. Torah is direction far more than it is teaching.
Or knowledge or something.
Right, and we have words for knowledge. Deah, Bina, Has, right? We've got words, but Torah comes loaded with something beyond knowledge, right? So it's worth taking the time to point this out here. So observe faithfully, right? I mean, we have that verb. Right? Gather the people, men, women, and children, the strangers in your community, that they may hear and learn to revere God by observing faithfully every word of this teaching, this instruction. In other words, how do you fulfill this? You do it. It's not enough to hear it and say, oh, I learned it. You know, my favorite is, well, Rabbi, I don't really need to fast on Yom Kippur because I understand its purpose. I studied it. I learned about it. As if knowledge somehow is the equivalent of doing. It's very rare that knowing something is the same, learning about something is the same as doing and experiencing it, right?
Watching someone else play the piano doesn't make you a player.
You might understand theory, piano theory. You might understand how the piano is built. But until your fingers are actually striking the keys, right? Their children, too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to review. This is the key element, this verse 13. This is all about what happens when the generation that came out of this is memory. This is about the social compact. Why are we going to gather in Jerusalem, this place that isn't named yet, every 7 years and hear this book read? Why doesn't God just appear every 7 years? Well, that's because you meet God in the desert, and you are going to become settled in the land, and I'm giving you this instruction book. And you're going to follow this instruction book because it's a living memory, and your children are going to learn it. And their children are going to learn it. And that is how, that's the beauty, that's what makes human beings so different than every other animal. There are numbers of things, right? People say tools, but animals use tools. Some people say fire, okay. But what really makes human beings unique is that we can record information and knowledge and experience in one generation and convey it to people generations hence. We can look back at the experience of those who've come before us, and we can plan for the generations that are going to come at. That is, we can communicate across time, as it were. Karen,
I'm sitting here thinking.
hold the mic, would you?
Oh, sure.
Just so people on the live stream hear you.
So I'm sitting here, I'm sitting here thinking that I wish God were more of a teacher. I hear the threat. You do what you're supposed to do. Here I'm telling you what to do, and if not, I will abandon you. You will be punished. Bad will befall. I get it. But you will do these things because of goodness and kindness and love and community and all of those things. Now you can say, but those are the prophets. Those are the people who are to teach this. There's not a whole lot of that.
And in fact, when we get to the end of this parsha in a little bit, it's a short parsha, Moses, in fact, has very little faith in the Israelites.
Very little.
Faith. Very little faith in the Israelites. He sees them as children. They're not even adolescents. He really sees them as recalcitrant children. Whereas when we get to the rabbinic period and the Israelites have perhaps matured into young adults, the rabbis are already teaching the reason you do mitzvot isn't for fear of punishment. You do it for the love of doing it. You're doing the right thing. That's not the tone here. The tone here is very much of a Moses who's 120 and has no real faith that these guys are going to behave themselves. So he falls into this place of this is like the exhausted principal who's been retired against his will and is giving the final speech to the faculty and the students. It has that ring, right? Okay, now verse 14 I'm going to read. I'm going to read 14 through 21. Page 1388. Okay? And I'm going to read verses 14 through 21, which, by the way, if you noticed, or really 14 through 23, this is considered an insertion. It reads so differently. Some people would say you should skip from 13 to 24, and then it reads very nicely, right? But we can't do that, of course, because the text is the text. Okay? But you could, in theory, skip from 13 to 24. And if you're saying, well, how can you even imagine that? There's a break. Look, you see that pay there at 13. Okay, so I'm going to read a little. The Eternal One said to Moses, "The time is drawing near for you to die." It's pretty blunt. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting. By the way, that term tent of meeting is never used in Deuteronomy. Here it is, but it's never used in Deuteronomy. It's used in Exodus and in Leviticus. But here it is. That I may instruct him, or command him, perhaps better. Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting. The Eternal appeared in the tent in a pillar of cloud. Again, that's new. That's not used in Deuteronomy. That's Exodus. The pillar of cloud having come to rest at the entrance of the tent. The Eternal said to Moses, "You are soon to lie with your ancestors. The people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst in the land that they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them." Now, there's a whole conversation amongst the medieval commentators. Does God really know the future? Does God not know the future? If God knows the future, then why doesn't God better prepare for it? Right? How can you punish people for something right? Perhaps it should be understood conditionally. Then why is Moses being told this in the hope to avert it? Then my anger will flare up against them, and I will abandon them and hide my countenance from them. Deuteronomy in fact, the Torah has never had this concept before, that God is going to play hide and seek. What do you mean you're going to hide your countenance from them? Aren't you always there? This idea of God hiding God's countenance, of being absent. It's like the parent says, you know what, my door's closed. I don't care what's happening in the rest of the house. This shows up in Isaiah, and I think Ezekiel. This does not show up in Torah. This I accept here. This is the unique place. This is one of the arguments that this material comes from the exile. It's interpolated. It's been put in here. Why? Because they're in exile. So they know what's coming. So they're throwing it back because they know what's coming, right? I will hide my countenance from them. They shall be ready prey, and many evils and troubles shall before them. And they shall say on that day, surely it is because our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us. In other words, God isn't here to protect us. God has left us. Yet I will keep my countenance hidden on that day. Not going to come to your rescue because of all the evil they have done in turning to other gods. The worst thing imaginable is disloyalty to your God. It's like adultery. Okay? Therefore, write down this poem and teach it to the people of Israel. That's 19. Vata kitvu lachem et hashira hazot vilamda. Do you hear that root there? Okay, teach. That's the verb for teach. Vilamda. You shall write down this poem and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths. Sima b'fichem. In order that this poem may be my witness against the people of Israel. Now, tradition takes this to mean the entire Torah, all 5 books. Others, the book of Deuteronomy, and some say, no, it's just this poem, which we're going to read. It's upcoming. When I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey that I promised on oath to their fathers, ancestors, and they eat their fill and grow fat, and turn to other gods and serve them, spurning me and breaking my covenant. So now we're hearing the philosophy and theology of the committee that's editing the Torah in Babylon. Why did this happen to us? Why were the Babylonians able to come in? Why was the northern kingdom destroyed 200 years ago? Okay, not quite. It happened because we were disloyal in our worship to Yud-He Vav-He. And many evils and troubles befall them. Then this poem shall confront them as a witness. Wow. Since it will never be lost from the mouth of their offspring. In other words, you're going to teach this to each generation. I mean, we still do this, right? I mean, bar, bat mitzvah. For I know what plans they are devising even now, before I bring them into the land that I promised on oath. Wow. That day Moses wrote down this poem and taught it to the Israelites. The poem, by the way, we assume is chapter 32, which is the next chapter, which is Ha'azinu, which basically speaks to God's perfection, God's deeds. So I'll let you read that at home on your own. That day Moses wrote down this poem and taught it to the Israelites. And God charged Joshua the son of Nun, be strong and resolute, for you shall bring the Israelites into the land that I promised them on oath, and I will be with you. Now, verse 24, again, you can just keep reading as if it's from 23, or you can read it as if it is the continuation from verse 13. Okay. When Moses had put down in writing the words of this Torah to the very end, Moses charged the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Eternal. Now this, again, notice it doesn't say the priests anymore, right? So we've got, right, the word Levite is still, and by the way, when we look at it, it's not the priests who carried the Ark, interestingly. It was the Levites. Saying, take this book of teaching, okay. Really, lakoach, it's an interesting verbal form, we won't spend time on that. Lakoach et sefer haTorah hazeh. Take this scroll of instruction. I'm translating very literally. Take this scroll of instruction. Sefer, when we use the word book, we mean one of these. A codex, a bound volume. They didn't have codices in the ancient world. They only had scrolls. Okay? So take this scroll of the instruction. Hang on, where was I? Thank you. Take this scroll of instruction and place it. Now, here's the question. I don't quite know what to do with a preposition, okay? And it doesn't matter, but it sort of matters, right? Mitzad Aron Brit Adonai. Place it beside the Ark of the Covenant. That's the gold box with the cherubs on top that have the second set of the Ten Commandments and the broken first set, right? Of the eternal your God, and let it remain there as a witness against you. Some people say there was a separate box. Some people have the tradition already, I think Rebbe Meir, that actually know the Torah scroll went inside with the Ten Commandments. So it's not totally clear from the language. Well, now here comes, right, and here comes these are all Moses' words, Karen, right? Moses charged, take this, right? So it's still Moses. Well, I know how defiant and stiff-necked you are. Even now, while I am still alive in your midst, you have been defiant toward the eternal. How much more then when I am dead? Gather to me all the elders of your tribes and your officials, that I may speak all these words to them, and that I may call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that when I am dead, you will act wickedly and turn away from the path that I enjoined upon you, and that in time to come misfortune will befall you for having done evil in the sight of the Eternal, whom you have vexed by your deeds. Wow. Then Moses recited the words of the following poem to the very end in the hearing of the whole congregation of Israel, which very oddly is where the Torah portion ends. And of course, the poem continues with next week's portion, Ha'azinu. why is this here? I think in part because if we assume that compositionally this was being edited in exile, the greatest hope in Babylon in exile was the return to the land of Judah, right, to southern Israel. This was the great hope. They had been promised by the prophet Jeremiah that the exile would conclude in one lifetime. Now, that being the case, how do you explain 50, 70 years of exile into the future? What are we going to say? Our God got beat up and fought back the gods, and while God was getting... No, because at the end of the day, we're going to explain our exile not as a political occurrence. We're not going to explain it as God being weak and other gods doing this to us. We're going to explain, and here's monotheism. What do you do when there's only one God who controls the universe? We brought this on ourselves. We brought this on ourselves. And so Moses is predicting this outcome. So you see, this was all predicted. But the good news is it's happened. The good news is it's happened. So we're reading it as a prediction of the future, but we're past it. Right? We're back in the land, right? Ezra comes back. I know Mitchie has studied this with me. Ezra is returning during the Persian period following the Babylonians. Ezra shows up at the water gate, right? That's the Haftarah that we read for Rosh Hashanah morning at first day, if you were paying attention. People are going, why are we reading this? Because it's taking place at Rosh Hashanah time. Ezra, Nehemiah, they're there. They build a reading platform, and they open up the Torah, and they start reading it to the people. The people don't even know what's in the Torah anymore. So the Torah is being edited and it's obviously got very ancient material in it, but it's an argument that you can get past your failures. But it's also an argument that those failures had been predicted and warned against, and we didn't listen. That is why, Karen, we get this kind of, Moses is at his wit's end with these people, and he sees, God has shared with him what's coming, the future. And Moses is like, maybe if I just tell them how terrible it's going to be, and he loses it, right?
It's tragedy.
Yes.
It's such a tragedy. He has led these people. He has been with these people. He has worried on these people.
Yep.
And now he has to leave these people.
And he doesn't want to die. The legends are quite clear he doesn't want to die either. God says, look, I took Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're, but nevertheless, Moses' leadership is what takes them into the promised land. They won't get there but for him. Joshua is not his equal. Joshua is just a leader. And now we have, again, that divisioning between Eleazar, Aaron's son, and Joshua. And eventually we'll get a tripart division, right? We're going to get king, priest, prophet.
Right. So can I ask a very simple question?
Yes, if you hold the mic up so other people can hear you.
I'm not sure I want people to hear. All right. So I'm beginning to understand, I think in a way I didn't before this very morning, what this is about. That we have the basic Torah. Okay, we have the Genesis, Leviticus, all of the 5 books. We've got that. And then what you've just said is that it's there is the future and looking back on and writing and modifying and putting in the Torah things like what we're reading. It has happened. And then there are all of these people, Isaiah, you mentioned names.
All are
who-
prophets.
They're
and later.
prophets who say they've heard the word of God, and they comment. So there are so many comments commentators, right?
Right.
And that's what we are
Right.
privileged to read and learn about, how people over the years have comment. And today we have writings as well.
Sure.
Comments.
One of the things I say to my bar bat mitzvah students and my confirmation students and my conversion students is Jews read Scripture in a very particular way that's different than how other people read their sacred writings. First of all, keep in mind that the Torah, which is part of the larger Bible, Holy Scripture, what Christians call the Old Testament, is not read in what some would call, we don't really read it in a Protestant style. Now, what do I mean by that? Protestants, as part of their philosophy, read directly from their translation into English or other language of the Bible, and not without, what's the term I'm looking for? Without, it's not intercession, but without anyone commenting. It's this direct, right? We're having, and it's a little bit like what happens for the first 200 or 300 times you read the Bible in Haftarah, which is you're having this wonderful dialogue with the clean, bare text in front of you. But traditionally, Jews read Torah and the rest of the Bible down through layer upon layer upon layer of understanding. It may be invisible, but it's there. Just like I told you, the language of Isaiah and Ezekiel, right? The reason a Jew can read Deuteronomy 31 and say, oh, I know that notion of God hiding God's presence. That shows up in Ezekiel. And then there's that verse in Isaiah. And then it's the language that's also used in the High Holiday prayer book. And in other words, we don't just read the clean text. When we experience the text, it's being read up and down through layers and layers and layers of discussion where those texts have bounced around, and we already know, right? We already know. When you read Jacob meeting Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandsons, in the book of Genesis, you already know that on Friday nights, parents bless their children with the same words Jacob is about to use to adopt his grandchildren. That's present at the reading. That is a traditional way of encountering Torah. Yes, you can read it cold and clean. You can read it cold and clean like you're reading it for the first time, and there's always a first time. But at a certain point where the story and the language and the verses become familiar, where we own them, because remember, you're gonna keep repeating this song in the mouths of your children, right? This is but the foundation level of an edifice that rises up and up and up. So when we're reading down from the top, whether we know it or not. It's like there are dozens of layers of adjustment of glasses, right? So they're clear, they're invisible, but they're there, right? And that's how we understand the text, through these many layers that were established of different teachers, different commentators. How can you read a text and not think of Rabbi Heschel talking about the nature of Jewish mysticism or sacred time? We bring all of that with us when we read this text. We are not reading a brand new novel that we've never read before, set in some place we've never heard of, with characters who have no, right? So when you're reading about Rachel, you're reading about your daughter or your granddaughter or your sister-in-law. You understand the point I'm making? We're reading about people 1,000 years later and 500 years ago. And so you can't, to really have the full experience, not the only experience, but the full experience, is to read. That's why Jews read Haftarah. Why do we read Haftarah? It's not given at Sinai any more than the weekly reading was given at Sinai. These are rabbinic customs. Why did the rabbis ask us to read Haftarah? Because they didn't want us to ignore the prophets. Why should we not ignore? Because the prophets, right? That's another layer. We're experiencing the weekly Torah portion, but juxtaposed through the lens of a prophet who lived several hundred years later. And then perhaps on a holiday like Sukkot, we're reading the writings a few hundred years later, and then we're reading the rabbinic materials. And does that give you a little bit of a sense? So that's the end of a rather long sermon on my part about how we read Scripture as Jews. I want to thank everyone who's on the live stream. You did not end up with a service today, and I am so sorry. But we did have a chance to focus on Torah. Yeah, we can turn that off. Mitchie, what do you want to say?
Yeah, so
Hold it close, hold it close.
your teaching, particularly today's, was, I feel, directly addressed to me, who is a newcomer to your tradition, and
Hardly a newcomer.
don't know much of those layers of traditions and commentary. I should be rather quiet, not to brag about whatever I know a little bit. It is quite a lesson. Thank you.
Well, what a pleasure. And you're hardly a newcomer. You bring decades of learning, and we are so grateful to have your teaching and your voice as well. It is one of the wonderful things about you. You just press the bottom and hold it for about 5 seconds. Hold the bottom, and it's going to turn off.